It was 2:13 a.m. on a Tuesday when dispatchers in a small city answered a call that would shatter the quiet. The caller's voice was broken, soft, the kind you hear when someone is still trying to believe that what they're saying is true. Lights flashed. Neighbors opened doors. Within minutes, the front lawn of a two-story home in a modest subdivision filled with officers, sirens, and the murmurs of a town waking up to a new kind of fear. "You never think it will happen to you," a neighbor later said. "Not here. Not in this neighborhood. Not to people like them." But the truth about violent crime is that it does not care for neat categories. It slips in through familiar doors. It hides behind smiles. It reaches into living rooms, kitchens, and sleeping rooms, places we assume are safe. Crime Snap USA brings you a complete, scene-by-scene account of the night, the investigation, and the legal battle that exposed the dark threads woven into a family's life. The call came from inside the house. Neighbors would later say the family had seemed fine. Mundane weekend barbecues, a dog, a minivan with soccer stickers, 2 cars in the driveway. When officers arrived, they found a chaotic scene. Overturned furniture, broken glass, and a woman in her 30s on the kitchen floor, conscious but heavily injured. A man, her husband, was nowhere to be found. The house smelled faintly of bleach and cigarettes. The living room television still glowed with a paused game show. The initial reports labeled it a domestic disturbance gone wrong. That label shaped the first 10 hours. Assumptions lead to directions. A quick canvass, a call for backup units, paramedics compressing wounds and asking questions no one could answer. Statements were short, eyes darting to corners, hands folded tight. There was also a second call that night, an anonymous tip that a car matching the husband's was seen leaving at speed. Officers rushed, traced the route through traffic cameras, and followed a trail of tire marks on a damp road toward the highway. The man had vanished. What the cameras captured would become crucial. A time-stamped image of the husband's car leaving the neighborhood at 2:28 a.m., dim taillights disappearing into the night. The next slice of footage showed the car parked by a rest stop nearly 90 minutes later. Inside, officers would say, they found more questions than answers. The investigation begins. Detectives arrived with the slow, methodical calm of people trained to turn chaos into patterns. They didn't yet have a suspect formally named. They had a missing person, a victim, and a house full of evidence. The statement from the injured woman was a bewildered string of names and dates. Her hospital identification bracelet read like an accusation she couldn't fully form: assault. Forensics combed the house. They photographed what they found: fingerprints on a wine glass, a smear of blood on the baseboard, fibers caught in a broken lamp. There was a voicemail on the husband's phone sent earlier that evening, a voicemail with a raised voice, a single urgent command. Police also recovered text messages, loving notes in the morning, terse arguments in the evening. Motive is often the last piece of the puzzle to fall into place, but here motives unspooled in small, sharp threads: jealousy, financial stress, secret accounts, the kind of petty betrayals that can escalate when ignored. Investigators also interviewed friends, coworkers, and family. A neighbor reported loud voices around midnight. A coworker said the husband had been distracted at work for days. An ex-partner hinted at previous episodes of volatile behavior. Each account was a sliver of meaning. Together they created a mosaic, not a portrait. A breakthrough came when forensics detected DNA under the victim's fingernails that did not match her own. It matched the missing husband. He had scratches consistent with a physical altercation. But there was also DNA not belonging to either. That unknown profile would widen the investigation. Were there more players? Was this a third-party intruder? Or evidence of a struggle with an unknown person during flight? The man on the run. Detectives focused on locating the husband. He was not a professional fugitive, but ordinary people sometimes improvise desperation very well. A trace on his banking history showed a withdrawal at a gas station on the interstate that night. A gas pump receipt attached to a trash bin behind a diner offered a small, tangible clue. CCTV footage from that pump showed the man buying a spray bottle and a towel. He had his hands over his face in some frames, eyes darting. He left without the minivan. Police pieced together a likely path. Drive far enough to be unnoticed, stop to clean, regroup, call someone for help. The spray bottle and towel suggested a plan to clean up, but clean what? The car, himself. The trail heated when a witness at a highway rest area recalled a man matching his description asking for directions and claiming his phone had died. The witness offered a name. It matched a relative known for helping family in trouble. It's critical to note how small human acts, a purchase, a request for directions, anchor large investigations. They are mundane behaviors leaving public footprints. In this case, the man's attempts to erase traces only led him closer to capture. He was found 3 days later, in the spare bedroom of a motel at the edge of a neighboring county. He was exhausted, hands stained with what appeared to be paint, not blood, a detail that would require explanation and would be used both by defense and prosecution in different ways. When officers arrested him, he offered varying accounts: denial, confusion, and then an imploded version of the night's events. The public narrative snapped into place. Husband missing, husband arrested, husband charged. When charges were filed: aggravated assault, false imprisonment, and later charges amended to include attempted murder, the story exploded through local news. Social media posts formed two camps: those who believed the husband's guilt immediately and those who insisted on presumption of innocence. Public opinion, like water, finds every crack. Hashtags trended for days. Vigilantism flared in comments sections long after the man's face had disappeared behind court transcripts. But media attention can do strange things to a case. Witnesses receive calls. Details alter as unhelpful nights morph into crisp memories. Defense lawyers argued evidence was contaminated, that investigators rushed to tie a neat bow. Prosecutors countered with a careful timeline, confident lab results, and witness testimony that placed the man at the scene. One pivotal element in the pretrial landscape was the injured woman's testimony. She presented in court with bandages reduced, voice steady but brittle. She said they argued about money, then about a text message. She remembered a glass shattering, waking to pain, and later clinging to the memory of breathing. Observers in the gallery whispered about the courage of victims, others whispered about inconsistencies in early statements. But trauma scrambles memory. It is neither surprising nor damning when accounts shift under stress. The defense attempted to introduce an alternative theory: that a second, unidentified intruder had attacked the wife while the husband fled in panic, fearing he would be blamed. The presence of unknown DNA added rhetorical fuel to this line of defense. The prosecution argued the DNA belonged to a prior, unrelated contact. Forensic pathologists explained the mechanics of the injuries: blunt force trauma, defensive wounds, and a pattern consistent with an assault where the victim tried to defend herself. Science does not tell stories. People do, but it often replaces rumor with measurable facts. The forensic report was thorough: blood spatter analysis, cellular material tests, and toxicology reports. Blood patterns suggested a struggle, not an accidental fall. A bruise pattern on the victim's arm matched the curvature of a common household object found in the trash outside a candlestick with traces of blood on its base. Latent prints on that object matched the husband's thumbprint. The defense called these circumstantial, the prosecution called them corroboration. Cellular analysis of the phone data revealed a series of calls and texts that night. GPS pings put the husband's phone at two crucial locations: the house at 2:05 a.m. and the highway at 3:42 a.m. The time gap coincided with the likely window of the assault. Forensics also found fibers on the victim's clothing that matched the seat fabric from the husband's car. Every piece of evidence, when placed together, created a timeline hard to refute. But forensics also raised deeper questions about behavior. Why would someone who planned to flee leave behind personal items? Why would he return to the neighborhood later? Forensic psychologists suggested patterns: impulsivity, fear, a messy attempt to reconcile panic with control. Those minute details: the time a call was made, the spot where the car was parked, became the scaffolding for prosecution's argument that the husband had acted violently, then fled. Defense lawyers worked to create reasonable doubt. They highlighted chain of custody issues, questioned the possibility of contamination, and pressed the lab technicians on protocol. They called a small army of experts: a DNA analyst who cautioned that partial profiles can mislead, a forensic pathologist who suggested some injuries could be self-inflicted through movement during collapse, and a traffic expert who argued that timestamp discrepancies made some of the GPS evidence less reliable. They also humanized their client. A husband, a father, a man with no significant criminal record, they argued. They called friends as character witnesses. They produced receipts showing the man had been withdrawal limited on payday, casting doubt on the money motive. They suggested the missing DNA came from a prior intimate partner who had visited days earlier. The defense did not deny there had been an injury. Rather, they reframed the event as a tragic fight that spiraled out of control, a moment of violence that did not intend to kill. Yet jurors do not adjudicate in a vacuum. They weigh facts, but also narratives. The prosecution painted a sequence: argument, assault, flight. The defense offered an alternative: argument, accident, panic. Which narrative fit the physical evidence better? The jury would decide. The trial lasted 4 weeks. Courtrooms are theatrical in a different sense. They are stages where memory, law, and human emotion collide. The prosecution opened with a crisp timeline and the woman's harrowing testimony. Graphic photos were admitted only after a judge ruled they were necessary to establish the degree of injury. The courtroom grew quiet as paramedics described their attempts to stabilize the victim. The defense countered with cross-examinations designed to show the limits of trauma's reliability. Key moments swayed observers: a witness who contradicted earlier statements, a lab report amendment that clarified but did not change earlier conclusions, and a defense expert whose tone seemed uncertain under cross. The jurors asked pointed questions in private. The judge patiently answered what the law permits. Outside the courthouse, protesters and supporters held signs. The local press summarized daily, then hourly. At closing, the prosecutor leaned on motive and opportunity. He asked the jury to imagine the rage, the jealousy, the small accretions of resentment that exploded into violence. The defense reminded jurors of the reasonable doubt standard: proof beyond a reasonable doubt, not proof beyond every possible doubt. It's a line that often divides verdicts. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When the verdict came, faces in the courtroom shifted like weather. Guilty on aggravated assault and false imprisonment, not guilty on attempted murder. The mixed verdict reflected the complexity of the evidence. Some elements convinced the jurors beyond reasonable doubt, others did not. Sentencing followed months later. The judge cited both aggravating and mitigating factors: prior displays of temper but also lack of prior convictions, remorse expressed in letters from family, and community standing. The man would serve a term that split the public. Some saw it as justice, others as insufficient. Appeals would follow. For the victim, the legal victory felt partial. A guilty verdict validates pain but does not erase trauma. She faced months of rehabilitation, physical therapy to regain strength, counseling for PTSD, and the quiet work of rebuilding trust. Friends rallied, but recovery is a private, jagged road. The community installed a neighborhood watch and hosted forums on domestic violence prevention. Law enforcement reviewed their procedures, acknowledging errors in paperwork and communications that complicated the chain of evidence. The department instituted training on domestic violence response and evidence management. Policies changed. Lives did not revert. This case was not unique. It folded into a national conversation about domestic violence, policing, and the limits of the criminal justice system. Experts in domestic violence told Crime Snap USA that the patterns were familiar: escalation over time, private tensions exploding publicly, and the complex interplay of abuse, shame, and fear. Shelters reported a spike in calls after the verdict. Community organizers pushed for better survivor services. The story rippled beyond the courtroom into legislative hearings where activists argued for stronger protective orders and quicker enforcement. At a town hall meeting, a police captain said, "We solve crimes with evidence, but we must also prevent them with systems. Prevention is the slow work. Better social services, more accessible mental health care, proactive community engagement." One local pastor started a support network for families in turmoil. A high school launched peer counseling. The case prompted people who had been silent to speak up, sometimes for the first time. There were also uncomfortable questions about media coverage. Was the case sensationalized? Did the 24-hour cameras and social feeds influence the words people offered under pressure? Journalists argued that public scrutiny built accountability. Others said it skewed perception and endangered witnesses. Forensic experts urged care. The county prosecutor announced a media policy change to protect investigations in their most fragile stages. Documentaries are, at heart, about people. Names change in news cycles but people remain. The injured woman returned to campus classes, determined that an assault would not define her life. She started volunteering at a crisis hotline, she later said, because she wanted someone else's whisper to become a shout that finds help faster. The husband served his time and applied for parole. He wrote letters, some apologetic, some defensive. He took anger management classes. Friends reported a quiet man who spent hours at the prison library. Rehabilitation, they said, is a messy, imperfect path. Neighbors who once watched each other from behind fences began to meet on porches. The fear did not disappear, but a fragile solidarity emerged. They organized safety apps, updated lighting, and built a community group focused on early intervention. Small administrative changes, faster police response to restraining orders, more thorough domestic violence training for dispatchers counted in human terms even if they appeared trivial on paper. Not every documentary ties everything neatly. There were unresolved points. The presence of unknown DNA, the question of whether others had been involved, and the tiny timing anomalies in the GPS pings. The appeals process would later pick up on these threads, focusing on procedural errors and newly surfaced testimony that suggested alternative scenarios. The legal system is iterative. No single verdict is always the last word. What remains true is that violence lives in small compromises. A dismissed complaint, a joke about temper, a neighbor who decided not to call. Prevention asks a lot of communities. Vigilance without paranoia, compassion without enabling. It asks individuals to notice and intervene when safe. It asks institutions to respond swiftly and knowledgeably when hurt occurs. This case, like many, becomes a teaching story. How to better protect survivors, how to restrain impulses that escalate, how to hold each other accountable without breaking the fabric of care. Crime Snap USA documents one neighborhood's trauma and the subsequent tug of war between accountability and redemption. When a house becomes a crime scene, it is not just property changed, it is memory altered. Rooms hold traces of fear, pictures on the wall continue to hang, but people feel different in them. The husband and wife in this story are more than headlines. Their lives, entangled with fear, law, and hope, mirror many others across America. The truth is rarely tidy. There are times when evidence forms a bright bead of certainty. There are other moments where doubts stretch wide and long. The work of justice is not only to punish but to illuminate, to create systems that prevent the small violences that become catastrophes. And the work of community is to care for the living, those who were harmed and those who have caused harm in ways that reduce future violence. For viewers at home, the takeaway is urgent but simple. If you see someone in trouble, do not look away. If you are struggling, reach out. If you suspect danger, report it. Systems can be slow, but a neighbor's call can change a life. Crime Snap USA will keep telling these stories, not to titillate, but to inform, to teach, and ultimately, to help build safer places to live. Months after the trial, the husband filed an appeal citing procedural errors and the presence of unaccounted DNA as grounds for a retrial. The appeal process continues to unfold in the courts. The victim, who asked to be identified only by her first name in most media, completed a rehabilitation program and now works behind the scenes with a nonprofit helping survivors navigate legal processes. The Neighborhoods Watch program remains active and has been credited with preventing 2 other escalation incidents over the next year. Local law enforcement reported an internal review and the adoption of new protocols for handling domestic violence calls, including mandatory specialized training for first responders and stricter chain of custody procedures for evidence. Community leaders established a task force to study how to better support survivors and to encourage early reporting.